Hello, everyone. We'll get started. Before we begin tonight's panel, I'd first like to acknowledge that this conversation is being hosted and recorded on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and we acknowledge the intergenerational trauma caused by colonisation. We pay our sincere respect to Aboriginal elders past and present. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal. Attendees, please be advised that tonight's panel will contain some references to murder, domestic violence, and abuse. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to In Conversation with Women for Australia. My name is Jess Lane, and I'm the founder of an online movement of more than 12,000 women and allies. We want to see more progressive women elected in 2022, and we are using our growing platform to help support these candidates. Tonight's panel is entitled Vulnerable Australia, and each of our panelists has extensive experience in campaigning on behalf of vulnerable people in our communities, so we're thrilled to have you. Last week, we saw the government's federal Band-Aid budget, a budget in which Treasurer Josh Frydenberg seemed to hope that the words cash payments and tax cuts would somehow give us all collective amnesia and we would forget about the last 9 years, namely about Scott's Hawaiian holiday, the vaccine stroll-out, the aged care crisis, welfare well beneath the poverty line, Indigenous deaths in custody, tweaks to the NDIS, public housing wait lists, treatment of women in Parliament and beyond, climate inaction, wage stagnation, Christian Porter's blind trust, gutting our university sector, the Inju card, their treatment of asylum seekers, cuts to public school funding, lining the pockets of Jerry Harvey and his ilk, not ordering enough rats, and of course, the religious discrimination bill. Folks, I want you to keep that list at the very front of your minds, at least for the next 6 weeks. Stick it on the back of your toilet doors. Make it your screensaver. Tattoo it to the inside of your eyelids, if you must, so that you can read it while you sleep. Because it's really true what Mahatma Gandhi said. The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Make no mistake, this government does not govern for all Australians. This election is shaping up to be the most important election in living memory. And if it feels like we are in the fight of our lives, that is because we are. The most vulnerable people in our community deserve dignity, respect, and support, and they deserve a government who is willing to provide those things. More importantly, there are vulnerable people in our communities who cannot advocate for themselves, so we must. And with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for tonight. Our very first panelist is Jane Caro. Jane has had a wide-ranging career as a social commentator, marketing and advertising professional, a lecturer in higher education, a board member, public education advocate, and author. Jane's work has been widely published, and her latest novel, which I've read, The Mother, tells an important fictional story of a mother whose adult daughter is trying to escape the clutches of a coercively controlling partner. Now, Jane is running for the hotly contested Senate in New South Wales for the Reason Party. Welcome, Jane Caro.
Thank you, Jess. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you, Jane. Really nice to meet you finally. Next, we have Suzie Holt, the community-endorsed independent candidate for the regional Queensland seat of Groom and our very first Queensland panellist. While Suzie grew up and studied social work here in Brisbane, she's worked primarily in regional Australia in the health, aged care and mental health sectors and raised her family in beautiful Toowoomba. Seriously, best flower show going. Go check it out. It's just amazing. So this election, Suzie is running a strong grassroots campaign based on local representation, integrity and trust in science. And she's proving to us everywhere that the independence movement is not just confined to inner city moderate Liberal seats. So big welcome to you, Suzie Holt. You're on mute, Suzie, just so you know. Finally, we have Dr. Rachael Jacobs, a university lecturer, academic and arts education advocate with Bollywood dance and aerial artistry among her many talents. Full disclosure, Rachael and I are friends and we've known each other. I was trying to remember how long we've known each other, Rachael. I think it's about 15 years now. That sounds really long now that I said it out loud, but since my university days at the Australian Catholic University in Brisbane, where Rachael was a lecturer. I also used to dance very badly in her Bolly Funk classes in Brisbane. Rachael has been a long-serving member of the Greens and has run in elections in Brisbane and now is running for the federal seat of Grayndler in Sydney. giving Albo a run for his money. So huge welcome to you, Rachael. All right, question 1 is just for Jane. Jane, I wanted to first ask you a quick question. A few of our followers have asked why you've chosen to run for the Reason Party rather than as an independent. In fact, I actually hadn't heard of the Reason Party until you announced your recent candidacy. So what are your reasons for running for Reason?
Okay, well, the first and most important is they rang me up and asked me. So that has an enormous effect on you. When somebody actually says to you, come on, put your money where your mouth is. Why don't you stand? And the reason that if I'm standing for the Senate, we always discuss standing for the Senate, not for the House of Representatives, then you really have to be part of a registered party. In fact, you have to have 1,500 minimum paid up members if you're going to get above the line. And no one votes below the line for the Senate, like about 3% of people do. So if you've got any chance of getting it at all, you've got to be above the line. So the Senate really is about parties. It's not as much about the ability of an individual with a grassroots campaign to actually, get a seat, as can happen much more in the House of Reps. So that's the first reason. The other reason is I looked into the Reason Party and I really liked what I saw. They are a relatively new party, which is why people haven't heard of them. But Fiona Patten, a lot of people are beliefs or any other kind of belief, but actually because that's what the experts, the people who've studied it, say is the right thing to do. It's about applying reason to our political life, which would be a nice change, don't you think?
Who would think? Who would think it?
Who would think it? Who would think it? So I was really pleased with that, and also I feel such disgust. The way you expressed it was perfect, Jess, in the intro about the current way this government is going, that I really thought to myself, I looked my grandchildren in the face and I thought, Zoe Daniels says it beautifully. She's standing as an independent in Goldstein. She says, if not me, who? And if not now, when? Well, precisely. That's how I feel.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. Brilliant reasons. All right, the question 1 for the panel tonight is from a Women for Australia follower. It is quite a general question, and I'd be interested to know your thoughts. She's chosen not to be identified, and she's chosen the pseudonym Nervous Wreck New South Wales. And her question is, I'm beginning to feel more confident that change is on the way in the upcoming election, but I'm afraid that so many areas of society are now in desperate need of repair. Then there may still be a very long wait ahead for many of us who are already doing it tough. When they are voted in, I wonder how the panel will set priorities and actions when absolutely everything from elderly care to single mothers, electric vehicles to closing coal mines, restoring Medicare, looking at superannuation inequality, plus the NDIS mess, all of these big issues and so many more all need urgent and thorough repair. So your question is, how can this mammoth task be tackled? And I might start with you, Jane. If we could just try and keep our, I'll start with Rachael this time, rather, and let's try and keep our responses to about a minute. So Rachael needs to be unmuted. So we do have a few technical issues. Steph, if you could just unmute Rachael.
Okay, hello, and thank you so much, Steph. Jess, great question, and it's great to be here. I'm on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, where sovereignty was never ceded, was, is, always will be Aboriginal land. And I think that's a really big question, because with everything that you listed in your introduction that was just so succinct about how messed up things are right now, it is easy to feel hopeless, and it's easy to feel like the problems are insurmountable, and it's easy to feel like politics possibly isn't the answer. And what I always encourage people to do is to also, can we look at the hopeful conversation as well? And I know it's hard, but in the last 3 years since the last election, there has also been an injection of hope. We're now looking towards young people who are walking out of their school classrooms, and they're going on strike because they're saying our leadership isn't serving us and it's not good enough, and I want climate action. We're watching the Black Lives Matters movement had the surge of uprising in 2020, and people get on board and say, I am also opposed to racism in all of its forms, and it's not just casual and intangible. This is something that affects people's lives, people of colour like myself, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore. What we're seeing is a power shift where people want power back in their hands. We're seeing people like Greta Thunberg and Malala being our celebrated leaders, rather than pale, stale and male that have sort of, epitomized Western society before. So I just want everyone to have hope that we can actually do this. It is a together movement. It is done by centering the lived experience of those like our questioner who has already told us they're doing it tough. It's by centering their experience, by listening to them, and by going to the solutions that can be found in communities, rather than in politicians imposing their will and thinking they know what's best for people. Communities actually have the answers, and that's one of the reasons why I'm running, is because I've worked in communities my whole professional life. I believe that that's where the answers lie, and I think that we need to do more listening.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Rachel. Suzie, we just need to unmute Suzie, Steph.
Thanks, Jess. I too would like to acknowledge the land on which we meet today, the Guyabal, Jarrawa and West Waka Waka people. And a good question, and it too comes back to as to why we're running. The past 12 months, we've been working a true grassroots community campaign. We've been reaching out and listening to the community, and we actually put it to the community. What is it? And are you ready for change? We are a very conservative seat. It has not changed any. It's been a Liberal National Party seat since Federation. And what has come back to us, so when we went and asked them, what is it? What has come back is that they're ready for change, and they're actually really excited. And what they want to do is bring people into the centre to grow our region together. So one of the biggest issues, and like the other panellists, I'm sure, is that all those, issues that you have raised, from housing to schooling to mental health to homelessness, they're all the issues that have come from our community. So people have said, yes, we know there's issues, but what they want now is people. So bringing people together to collaborate and move forward with effective solutions and working together. So I think in terms of, even though it seems overwhelming, we've already created change. The other most exciting thing is in our electorate, we actually have women standing. That hasn't happened for a very long time.
And that's great.
It's great. So, here we are with change already happening in our region, and even to have those conversations open up, we've already won in our seat. So to seem overwhelming, however, they want to deal with it. They want solutions. And in fact, I think in some ways people want action. So I agree with you. It is a call to action. So to stand as an independent is that call to action to start addressing those issues, and also bring it back to our community and in a really positive way.
Thank you, Suzie. And Jane?
Well, look, I think a couple of things. The first is, it's another reason why I'm standing for the Senate. If we get a more progressive House of Representatives, which, the polls are indicating is likely, and let's hope so, that's great. And it's really important, and that may help get us some of the changes that we all really want. But if they face a reactionary Senate, nothing's going to change. So actually, we really need to recognise that it is important to vote for the change we want in both houses of Parliament if we want to.
Absolutely.
So that's a really important practical thing to take seriously when you go to the ballot box. But the way you change things is the same, whatever you're doing it in. It's bit by bit. Anyone who promises you that you can wave a magic wand and make all these very wicked and difficult problems just go away is lying to you. That is not going to happen. But if we can start to make changes to the rate that we pay, raising the rate, for example. That's a simple change that could be done. Getting rid of that pernicious cashless debit card, a simple change that could be done. Setting better, stronger, more realistic targets for lowering our emissions. 2050 is way too late. We've got to do it quicker than that. If you set those targets, business is champing at the bit to do something. As soon as they have targets to work for that are locked in by legislation, let me tell you, that'll be off and running. It is in the rest of the world. We've been left behind by a supposedly pro-business government that seems not to understand the very first thing about business and investment and keeping up. So there are many things we can do, and change will start to happen, but we can't change it overnight. It will take time to get these things happening, but a lot of them are practical and can be done quite quickly.
And it's good bit by bit is enough to give people hope, I think, in the short term. Absolutely.
Got to be realistic too with what we promise. No good in over-promising and under-delivering. That just leads to cynicism and disappointment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to move on to criminalising coercive control. The inquest into the murders of Hannah Clark and her children, Aaliyah, Leanna and Trey, wrapped up in Brisbane last week. I followed the coverage and the testimony, and I just wanted to rage cry every time I read something about this inquest. Hannah did absolutely everything she could within our current system to avoid that terrible outcome, and they still couldn't be saved. We've seen all of this before. We've had so many inquests into this type of violence. And if we as a country cannot turn and face this, even after what happened to Hannah and her children, what would it take? And when elected, how will you help to ensure that we achieve meaningful change to help victim survivors attempting to escape domestic violence? Jane, let's start with you now.
Well, of course, the book you've read, Jess, the mother, is very much about coercive control and the difficulty of escaping an obsessed partner. There are a number of things we could do. One of the first is to make it easier and safer for women to leave abusive relationships, which means we need to give them somewhere to go. We need to give them money to go with. We need to understand that they're suffering from trauma, and we need to make sure that they get trauma-informed treatment, not just tell them that they've got borderline personality disorder and stigmatise them via that way. With, first responders, often we say they've got post-traumatic stress disorder and we give them a lot of help, as exactly we should. But sometimes the victims that those people have been responded to get told they've got borderline personality disorder. There's something wrong with them, not something terrible's happened to them. There's something wrong with them relatively quickly. And amongst those in particular is making sure that women have enough money to go, somewhere safe to go, and that they will not, if they leave, find themselves under threat of losing their children because they face homelessness, which is one of the pernicious things that happens. So we need to centre the women and the children who are escaping and work out what they need and provide it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. Suzie.
Jess, I too followed that, the progress of that. I'm actually very proud of our state that is following it through. And I actually am really proud that following the report, that they're actually doing it properly and they're implementing it properly over time. I know people want it now, but they're actually going about it in a very respectful and meaningful way. So I think that's actually a great start. From a regional perspective, domestic violence is a huge issue in one of our regions, in areas within our region. It's actually the biggest issue for the police out there. So we have seen an increase, particularly since COVID, of this issue. The last year, one of our community organisations that offers support services for women has seen 2,020 women in a year. Wow. So it's a huge area and like many regions, I think they would be experiencing the same thing. I have made it very public since announcing that this is a prime area that we must invest in. We need greater facilities. We also need increased healthcare responses to it. We also need to work across organisations, local council, all levels of government to address this, and it's huge. And I'm hoping that working with the state government, we may be able to invest, particularly locally, but also to see fruition. It is a need, and it will continue to be a need until we address it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Suzie. And Rachael.
Yeah, that like everyone and all our panelists and like yourself, Jess, the rage crying is absolutely real. And when we think about, you know, the number of times and ways that the system failed Hannah and her family is just absolutely devastating. So I'm really proud to be part of the Greens that have been real leaders in this area. So our member of the Legislative Council in New South Wales, Abigail Boyd, introduced a bill to make coercive control illegal, and it's absolutely essential, and that is so important that law change happens, so that the actions that lead up to this, often we're finding out about abuse when it is quite far gone, when people are in situations that are extremely difficult to where the consequences, as we know, are dire and they are real. So it's about making illegal exerting control over somebody's finances, about restricting freedom, about restricting their access to social services and healthcare services and things like that. But why this is so important is also the shift in societal attitudes that has to come with it. So once people know that those actions are illegal, it is illegal to control someone in that way, we are going to start to believe women more. And that's the shift that has to happen. So that when we find out that a partner is being controlling, there's not a question of, oh, he might be just a bit, you know, like this, or was he a bit of a prude that he didn't do that, or was he a bit of a this? It is like, no, that is an illegal and controlling and abusive action, and draws a hard line under it. Of course, as Jane mentioned, it's all, you know, there has to be places for women and families to go. There's, you know, it's not much use if people have these laws, but there are support services that are unsupported when people are able to leave. There must be affordable housing at the end of it. This is why women feel trapped, is because they think, right, where's the affordable housing option for me? Could it really be any better out there? So it's about fixing the whole raft, but that change of law is absolutely essential. And can I just encourage all of our audience to jump on board and find out about the coercive control bill, and find out and get on board with the campaign to change laws.
I will do that. Thank you, Rachel. And this leads into my next question, which is about homelessness and public housing. So this question is from Donna, who's one of our followers. And her question is, how can we prevent millions of dollars being wasted on election advertising and lifelong incomes for millionaire politicians when there are 49,000 homeless women in Australia? Yesterday, I witnessed 4 families living in their car near a park so that they could access the amenities block in Taringa, which is a high socioeconomic area in Brisbane. Suzie, we might start with you this time.
Look, homelessness, like many in other regional areas, is huge. We have about 2,000 people homeless or sleeping rough in our region. In crisis, it's an issue that is being dealt with predominantly through we need to address it straight away. I think providing adequate housing is certainly on the agenda, and affordable housing is a national housing strategy to deal with it. The flow-on effects from homelessness that I have concerns about are that they end up in our hospital system, which is incredibly difficult at the moment because it's being overwhelmed, and so we need to stop that happening as well. The other issue that our people in our region that we're listening to is that options to actually retrain or help people for short periods of time so they can stay in homes and not the streets. So short-term solutions that used to be around when I was a social worker, I want people to be able to, you know, once they feel confident, to be able to stay in their place of safety, back on the streets. So I put a call this afternoon to one of our local organisations, and she said in the last year they've given out over 200 sleeping bags for rough people. That's about 1 of about 5 people in our region. The biggest issue for that is around women over 50. We're seeing an increase in women and also families, young families who are now living in the street like you, Jess. I've heard of stories had raised within our community groups is disability. So we're impacted by the floods, but many of our people with disabilities are now homelessness and relying on community members to feed them, and they're staying in cheap hotels. So it's a huge issue that needs cross-government levels to really come on board and start addressing as a matter of urgency.
Absolutely. Thank you, Suzie. Next, we'll hear from Jane.
Yeah, my book Before the Mother, Accidental Feminist, was very much about need to care for others, as they were told to do, ahead of their right to earn an income. So they've ended up with no super and, getting out of the workforce as an older woman. It's extremely hard to get back in. So this is the reason this is becoming such an issue. The vast majority of single women, older single women who are living in private rental accommodation, are actually living in poverty and terrified that they will lose the roof over their head. This is not a reward for a lifetime of looking after other people. It's not even vaguely reasonable. So one of the things we need to look at is rental accommodation, because, really affordable housing is not about cheaper housing to buy. It's about cheaper housing to rent. And it's particularly, I think, about public housing and making that available to people. It's a human right to have a secure roof over your head. And we've turned housing into a market instead of thinking about it as actually as much a right as getting an education or being able to access healthcare regardless of your income. It's exactly the same process as that, and we have to really turn around the way we think about people's right to a roof.
Absolutely. And I think I've heard, and I could be wrong, but I've heard that the wait list for public housing is up to 10 years or something like that.
It's unbelievable.
That's appalling.
Yeah, because we sold it all off, because we drank the neoliberal Kool-Aid like the rest of the Western world, or those influenced by Rupert Murdoch anyway. And it's been an absolute unmitigated disaster.
Oh, just it's rage inducing. Sorry, Rachel.
I can't agree more with all of that. And it's still being sold off. There's public housing, areas here and just next door to Grayndler and things like that, and where there's actively being sold, or areas being sold to developers and things like that, and there is no plan for the people who are going to be kicked out of an area that they've called home for years and years and years. And those wait lists are so unbelievably long. And that's what's pushing people into homelessness. And it's a mind shift to be what's pushing people into homelessness is the system. It is not the people themselves. They are being victimized by the system. And absolutely, housing is a human right. I'm proud to be part of a party that sees it as a human right and has a plan to build. We have a 1 million homes plan, and 750,000 of those are dedicated to public housing, so that we can slash the waiting lists for public housing for people who are homeless or who need emergency accommodation or are just in need of public housing. That shouldn't be so stigmatized. And there are other options for affordable housing, which I won't take you through. But here in my electorate of Grayndler, what we have is a $2.1 million in some places median house price, unaffordable rents, right next door to people who are sleeping rough and people who are couch surfing, the invisible homeless that we don't see. We have the people and families sleeping in cars, and these live right on top of each other. What does that tell you? It tells you that the system is so broken, that when all of those things together, that we've invested so hard in things like negative gearing, we've invested so hard in tax breaks for home ownership, for multiple rounds of home ownership, for landlords who have multiple properties. We have forgotten what's happening at the other end. And that's where the crisis is. And that's where we need to start.
Absolutely. And they should totally build public housing in wealthy areas. They should start in the wealthiest areas and build that public housing. Absolutely. Question 4 tonight is, I know is policy passion of Jane's and Rachel's, is about public school funding. Now, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg likes to brag about the record funding that he has provided for schools in Australia, while omitting the inconvenient fact that much of this funding is going to the wealthier schools who need it the least. So, in fact, Mr. Frydenberg will cut $559 million worth of funding from our public schools over the next 3 years, while private schools will get a funding boost of $2.6 billion with a B. This is entrenched disadvantage of such a measure. It just makes me wild. And I'm a teacher, so I do have a vested interest in this as well. So I guess my question is, what are we going to do to address inequality in education now? Let's start with Jane.
Okay, there's a number of things we could do straight away. And certainly I think the Labor Party has in fact promised to do the first of them. And that is to bring every single public school up to the minimum resource standard immediately. Because at the moment, every single public school in Australia, bar a handful in the ACT, is resourced below the minimum agreed resource standard. Even though, as you say, rightly say, Jess, public schools educate the most expensive to teach children because they educate kids with disabilities, every child, and kids
they can't discriminate.
They don't discriminate, and they can't. The private schools can say, "Oh, that child's going to be a bit of a problem." Off you go to the public schools. You don't fit our culture. They cream off the cheapest and the easiest to teach, and they also choose which areas they'll run a school. Public schools can't do that either. So every private school in Australia, bar a few in the Northern Territory, is resourced above the minimum resource standard already, and some of them are resourced way, way above. So that's the first thing we could fix. The second thing we could do is we are the only country in the world that funds private schools the way we do. No one else comes close to us. We're the world's leading public funder of private schools. Our results are shit. It doesn't do us any good. We're not a top performing system by any means, but nevertheless we keep tossing billions of dollars at already luxuriously resourced school for reasons I don't understand. So one of the things we could do is we could say, okay, the average cost of educating a child in a public school is X amount. Let's say it's $10,000 for the sake of it. It's around that. So every school that charges of fees above $10,000 could go on a sliding scale of the amount of public funding they get. And beyond a certain point, they don't get any bloody funding. Because if you're charging $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, $30,000, $35,000, $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 a year for a kid who's probably costing you somewhere like remember the private schools do the cheapest kids, say $8,000 a year, where's all that bloody money going? It's not getting us any more choice, because of course the public subsidy of private supply is always inflationary unless you cap the fees charged. We've seen this happen in the first homeowners scheme, we've seen it happen in childcare subsidies, and we see it in private school subsidies, because it's marketing 101. The market will charge what the market will bear. So if you don't cap the fees that the schools can charge, they just take the subsidy, thanks very much, put it in their back pocket and charge the parents what they were going to charge them anyway, because they're not stupid. Unlike the government, unlike Josh Frydenberg, unlike all the people who defend private school funding at the current rate, which is outrageous beyond belief, doesn't save any money. There are so many private schools now where the students are funded as much public dollars or more than similar public schools. So it's not saving us a cent. And it doesn't get us anything. It doesn't get us more parental choice. It doesn't get us higher results. It doesn't help the kids that it goes to, because they're already doing fine and they've got masses of resources anyway. And in fact, it drives the gap between the kids who have and the kids who have not. We are hobbling our future by literally starving our most disadvantaged students of the money they need to reach their potential. When you don't equitably educate your future talent as well as the rest of the world does, you are hobbling your competitive future. I mean, let's forget social justice, fairness, or that we care about children, just from sheer common sense and good
reason,
using it bloody reason, for God's sake. It's crazy the way we do it, and it's a hideous waste of money. Children do not need dressage centres to get a good mark. They really don't.
We need to cut out that bit of footage and send it to you, Jane, because that was just rad. Thank you. Rachel.
Yeah, I just agree with everything. And I just want to say that today is a real thrill for me. I've been a public education activist and advocate my entire life. I was one of the founding members of an organisation called POPE, the Promotion of Public Education.
Oh, I know POPE.
And Jane is one of my heroes, because we teachers, I'm a school teacher myself, I'm a registered teacher still, I'm at Western Sydney University training the next generation of teachers now. We teachers have been screaming for years and years and years. And when Jane comes on board with a very loud microphone, all ships in the tide rise. And what Jane has done for public education advocacy has been absolutely tremendous. It is devastating to me that the Greens didn't call first. But Jane, I'm just a huge supporter of yours, and it's really amazing to be sitting virtually side by side on this platform with you, because I sit side by side with you on all things education. So what we're seeing is, we can talk about the dollars and things like that, but what we're seeing is an entrenched class divide. And it starts with our youngest, our little ones, our most vulnerable, entrenching a class divide in children that is morally reprehensible. That is the situation that we're faced with, that no other country does it like this. We have got to a point where the funding model is amoral. That's exactly where we're at. So if we start from that point, I'm a member of the New South Wales Greens, and the New South Wales Greens have said that that if you would like to run a private school, that needs to be privately funded. The no public money should be going to non-government schools. And that's because the public schools are starved of funds and need that massive injection of funds. But I've mentioned I'm a teacher. I'm an education researcher. I've consulted for UNESCO and the OECD. I've taught in the public education system. I have a PhD in education. I am a proud product of Australia's public school system. I have devoted my entire life to education, and I'm not just saying this to big note myself. I'm saying I kind of know what I'm talking about, that I've studied the best education systems in the world that do not have private education. So if you think it can't be done, if you think that we've walked so far down the road of choice, of school choice, the mantra of choice, that we can't walk that back, I say to you, look at the best school systems in the world and ask, what can we learn from them? We cannot learn. What we're not going to get better by is inflating an already inflated, overprivileged system. We're not going to get better by giving handouts to those who don't need it, by giving the wealthy welfare. That doesn't work like that. What we need to do is put the money where it's needed, and that is in the best public education schools in the world, which is what we have right here, but you've got to back it.
Absolutely.
Back it.
It's not a cost, it's an investment. Suzie, I am a little bit conscious of time, so if you could just keep your response to this question fairly brief.
So we agree, we're an educational hub. We see it as an investment in the long term. I've got schools that don't have musical instruments. I've got all my people from our region saying this is an area of rage for them, that they want it addressed. Some of our schools are at breaking point, and the lack of funding has tipped them over the edge. And yeah, certainly it's something that we would see that needs to be addressed and move forward. The other issue that we have for regional areas, which is separate to this, is that because we've had an influx, like many areas, of people to our regions, we actually need more schools. So we actually need more infrastructure, and we don't have a council that can do that. So like many people, we actually have seen an expansion of our population with huge growth areas. So we actually need more schools as well. So that's a huge issue for us as coming into the election.
You've got a number of really quite prestigious private schools out Toowoomba Way. I see them as I drive through. They're very fancy schools. Thank you, Suzie. All right, so we are running a little bit low on time, so let's try and keep our responses to the next maybe 1 or 2 questions fairly brief. My next question is about refugee policy. It might be a little bit hard. The Morrison government recently reached a deal with New Zealand to finally resettle a number of asylum seekers that have been languishing in detention for some as long as 9 years. Sadly, the fate of the Murugapan family from Biloela remains uncertain, which is making me very upset. Is this resettlement simply a cynical ploy to clear an inconvenient problem away just before an election? And if so, how will you use your platforms to advocate for more compassionate approaches to asylum seekers? Rachael, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks for putting this on the agenda, because I want to make sure that it's on the agenda. I'm running against Anthony Albanese, who supports mandatory detention, who supports refugees in detention, who supports refugees in prison, who will not line up and say that I support international law, which means that people can seek asylum. This is really devastating for me. I've taught inside Billawood Detention Centre. I've worked with refugee communities as part of my teaching work. I still do. And so this strikes really hard. I also will not forget the election where Kevin Rudd announced that no refugee who arrives by boat will set foot on Australian soil and open banners and offshore detention. So what needs to happen is an absolute shift of mindset, because I see that we have we've got the USA deal, we've got the New Zealand deal, and I'm so pleased for every refugee who is able to walk out of detention, a free person as they should be, because they've committed no crime. But the message is anywhere but here, that you should go somewhere else, that you don't belong, that you have nothing to offer this country. To our friends, the Biloela family, that's disgusting. The community is so proud of them. They were in such an important part of their community. And for our government to turn around and say, you have no value here, it's criminal. It's just absolutely criminal, and it's absolutely disgusting. I'm proud to be a member of the Greens. It's actually one of the reasons I got involved in politics, is because Australia's actions on refugees are a matter of national shame. I could talk forever on this. We need to devote, a whole segment, or let's call it a whole election campaign to this. But I'll pass over to Jane and Suzie to continue the conversation.
Well, when we start podcasting, Rachael, you can come back and talk to me about it all you like. Next, can we have Suzie? Suzie.
Without question, first of all, they want that family home to Biloela. Every single person that we have spoken to, that is the first, it's been a strong commitment from our community that we want those people back in Queensland. And they have demonstrated that they are valuable members of the community. Our region has been known for being, actually in Toowoomba, a refugee welcome zone. And in some ways we have led the way in terms of welcoming refugees. In fact, we attended a Harmony celebration day, which was extraordinary. It brought people, and we are known for being a welcoming community, a diverse community, and a respectful community. Having said that, I put this to many of our members today about this policy, and many members of our community, and without question, this is so in our group, we've got people from across the divide, that the current business model for refugees has been made redundant by brutal policy, and it actually needs to be reviewed.
Absolutely. Thank you. And shout out to the Biloela community. You are amazing. Thank you for your love and your advocacy. We absolutely support you. And Jane.
Yeah, I mean, these people have committed no crime. They have sought asylum, which is entirely legal, to run away from oppression and to seek a better life. And indeed, I think often the people who do that are the best of people, the most, the bravest, the most courageous. And what a loss to Australia that we had an opportunity to have these wonderful people settle here and add and contribute to our society, and instead we've turned them into people who quite understandably are never going to feel particularly positive about us, quite reasonably. Human suffering should never be used as a deterrent. This is just basic morality. And one day Australia, yet again, is going to have to apologise in its parliament for its treatment of refugees. And I am sick and tired of the Australian Parliament having to apologise for things that it should never have bloody well done in the first place. That this leveraging of racism was a cynical thing to try and neutralise Pauline Hanson, and it has been a stain on our country and a shame ever since. I will, if elected, do absolutely everything I can to be a voice for the changing of these policies. I would say that I think the deal that's been done just recently is probably an example of what I'm calling the independence effect. That Scott Morrison is moving to do some things like give money back to the ABC as well, possibly even these offshore wind farms, because he's terrified of losing those seats.
Yes, he's shaking in his R.M. Williams boots. It's gorgeous.
Correct. It's really good to see. So even before the independents get elected, they are having a positive effect on our policy. This is good.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, the next one is about the religious discrimination bill. Scott Morrison's highly contentious religious discrimination bill, which particularly targeted the LGBTQIA+ community, particularly young people, was shelved recently after swift public backlash, which I was pleased about, and a number of its own party members crossing the floor to vote against it. Do you think, though, that this is the last we've heard of such divisive bills? Suzie.
I'd like to say yes. That bill's it was traumatic for our community because it actually has caused some issues in our region, particularly we were one of the lowest in terms of marriage equality. We just crossed over the line and our current Liberal federal member voted yes. So people are still thinking about the marriage equality bill in itself. When this came up in the religious discrimination, when it came up this year, people were very nervous. In fact, our phones were inundated and people were wanting a response. What we saw on the floor, and I would have supported it, was when Rebecca Sharkey made the amendment, particularly in terms of protecting trans people from that bill, and that was where we would stand. That's where I would sit, and I commend her for what she has done in terms of protecting people from under that act. That's exactly what needed to happen.
Absolutely.
And I would like to think that moving forward, particularly from what we're getting from our community, they are tired of divisive politics. They are tired of these sorts of issues coming up to cause division, and they don't want it anymore. They actually want people to focus on policy development, to create a vision, to create a growth, rather than bringing back down to these issues that people just want to move forward from it.
I feel that too, and I'm hoping it's not just because I'm in my particular echo chamber a lot, but I do feel that, and I hope that we're right. Jane.
I just have a simple response. It has always struck me that the argument in favour of this bill, which I really despise, has always reminded me of the argument the Confederate States used to defend slavery during the US Civil War. Basically, it boils down to people saying, you are discriminating against me when you stop me discriminating against others. This is a morally bereft position. It's the same as the Confederates said, you are impinging on our rights as free states to hold other human beings enslaved. It's the same argument. You're enslaving us by refusing to let us have slaves. Same logic. And it is just as morally reprehensible. There is no excuse. No one should be discriminated against because of their religion, but that's a different thing from saying I should be allowed to discriminate against others because of my religious belief. No,
Absolutely.
Sorry. No, you can't.
It was a very clever play on words from Mr. Morrison. So it's good that we've made that point. Thank you, Jane. And Rachel?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think any time that anybody thinks that they should be exempt from the Anti-Discrimination Act, we should be asking questions about why. Why? So the reason is that this is a backlash. This is pandering to the religious right after the marriage equality debate. So the LNP can be like, I've got your back, I'm still on your side, still fighting for you, a bit of values politics and things like that. And disgustingly, the Labor Party came on board and voted for it. And they're going to give you some line about how it was some tactic to get for it to get voted up or down or whatever. Pure and simple, don't vote for bills you don't agree with. That's the end of the story. Is it dead? Let's bloody well hope so. But Labor's actions on this bill show that they can't be trusted, so we don't know. We are still in a fight to kill the bill. We're still in that fight to get rid of, to eradicate transphobia, homophobia, queerphobia. There were also religious organisations like the Hindu Council of Australia initially came out opposed this bill because they were worried about that people could discriminate against them on the basis of their religion that is not perhaps mainstream or not religious right or anything like that. So everyone hated this bill. It was hated by pretty much everyone. And so it's just got to go. It's got to be absolutely binned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good answers. Fabulous. All right. It's no secret that the welfare system remains beneath the poverty line here in Australia, and the LNP is now privatising some welfare payments with the use of the Indue card. Additionally, vulnerable people who receive social security payments do not accrue superannuation, which has long-term negative effects of their own, particularly in retirement. In fact, the pandemic was the only time in recent memory that people on welfare were temporarily able to live with financial dignity. That was probably because a number of LNP voters suddenly found themselves within this same welfare system, interestingly enough. So what measures would you support to improve the welfare and superannuation systems, Jane?
Well, first of all, raise the rate. So we need to make our payments to welfare recipients livable rather than, I think it's currently $46 a day, which is devastating for anybody. No one can live on that. To condemn people to literally an unlivable wage is, I don't understand how you do it. The other thing is we get rid of the Indue card, the cashless debit card immediately. It is a way of privatising welfare. So basically it is a wealth shift from the very poorest to the very richest, which is one would have thought the opposite way that welfare ought to go. So the privatisation of welfare is a really scary thing, has to stop. It's a pernicious and cruel and stigmatising card, and it must go. The other thing we need to do is make sure that we don't regard people who face misfortune, who lose their job, who go through a health crisis, who are escaping domestic violence, all the reasons that people often find them, or just grow old. Because those are all the reasons that people find themselves unable to find jobs, unable to afford homes, etc., etc. We must stop regarding this as somehow their fault, as if the poor are wicked and evil, which is what the cashless debit card says. It basically says you're poor because you can't manage your own finances. You're clearly a gambler or a drunkard or a wastrel. No, these are just people who've fallen on hard times, and it can happen to anyone. It is this absolute desire to divide society into winners and losers and stigmatise the losers as somehow completely due to their own misfortune. The things we need to do to fix super, well, first of all, we need proper equal pay for equal work, because we won't get fair super until women are paid the same as men. So that is a huge basic thing that we have to fix. We have to have affordable, if not free, early childhood education. That also allows women to stay in the workforce and go back into the workforce. We need to remove the tax disincentives that mean when a woman goes from 3 days a week work to 4 or 5 days a week, she suddenly leaps up to something like 90 or 95% tax rate, losing the benefits. And some women actually find they have to pay to go to work. Their family is that much worse off if they go to more full-time work, because they're not accruing super the whole time that they're in that kind of casual occupation, or not enough. I believe that we should put forward a policy that says that anytime anyone takes time out of the workforce to care for others, be they small children, frail and aged parents or relatives, someone with a disability or a chronic illness, We should pay their super. The government should pay their super.
Absolutely.
I reckon it would be revenue neutral because we would be saving on the care of the people who need care, and we would also be saving having to have the people who are doing the caring at the end of their life ending up on welfare, as is currently happening.
Absolutely.
So there's so many things we could do to improve.
Suzie and Rachel, we are running a little bit short on time.
Sorry,
did you have anything specific? Oh, it's not your fault, Jane. We had a lot to get through tonight. Did you have anything specific to add to that other than to maybe agree or because I do have a question on aged care and the NDIS that I really want to get to before we go.
After you, Suzie.
I support Jane. It needs to be reformed. One thing that I would like to add is that when women who haven't been working in the workforce, whether that is being a carer, looking after kids, we need to provide training so they can go back to work and we can support them to go back to work. And I agree wholeheartedly. It needs reform so we have equitable access for women to super.
Thank you, Suzie. And Rachel, did you want to add something quickly?
It is Green's policy to raise the rate to $88 a day, which is livable and will take everyone to above the poverty rate. But just to keep this in mind when you vote. If you want these things, you have to vote for them. I was on Q&A the week after the last election where we were all kind of dumbfounded and mystified about what just happened. And I remember one person called in who had voted Liberal and said, I will always vote in my interest. It is in my interest that everybody lives above the poverty line. It is in nobody's interest that people are entrenched into poverty. So I just want people to keep that in mind when they vote.
Absolutely, please do. That's great advice. I'm going to go to my NDIS question because it's quite a long one and it's from one of our followers. Her name is Rana, and it is in the form of a personal story of her experience with the NDIS. And she writes, there is a huge amount of talk about funding for the NDIS, but very limited conversation about how to change the system to be less traumatic for vulnerable people. The application process breaks people. I'm going to try and get through this without crying. I personally used $4,000 worth of personal savings, my entire financial buffer, in order to provide the NDIS with the reports required for myself. I waited in desperate need of support and with no money left to pay for them myself for months, nothing. I was grateful to know Senator Jordan Steele John, who made a call for me, and within 2 hours I was accepted. But they rejected my primary physical disability, regardless of my reports, functional capacity assessments and more. They offered me funding for psychology, for depression and autism. I had to fight for well over a year to get funding for anything more. And still to this day, they claim I can only use that funding for autism and depression related therapies. I can have a 4-day respite trip in a fancy hotel with food, support workers and activities. But can I buy my walking frame that I need? No. I am too exhausted to fight for myself anymore. I'm a single mum of 2 kids with 9 diagnoses between them, and who I have to fight the NDIS for years. They are my priority. Surely there is some way to provide support for vulnerable people without breaking them first and during. I'd really like to hear from some practical changes that could be implemented and what that would look like, and who is actually willing to take on some of that action. So Rachel, let's start with you.
Yeah. So thank you so much to Rana for sharing that story, and my heart goes out to her and many others like her, and thank you, because it's the personal stories that are going to flip this. So my sincere thanks, because we know that that disabilities are probably the largest minority group. And by the way, it's a group that any of us have potential to go into at any time and any stage. And that's not the reason to fix the NDIS. The reason to fix it is because it's abhorrently broken, like what Rana just described. And I thank Rana for citing Green Senator Jordan Steele John, who is a disabled man, who is an incredible advocate and activist who does that case by case work and has been such a valuable addition to our parliament. One of the things that Jordan has done is work on abolishing independent assessments, and had a win with that last year. And that was those dehumanizing assessments that were made where people with permanent disabilities were asked when they're going to get better or when they could get back to work, or to estimate. One of the other problems is that those assessments are outsourced to a private company. So they're done by people who aren't necessarily connected and tapped into the system. And that, look, privatisation in all its forms, this is just one example of how it can go so terribly, terribly wrong. So I really appreciate that Rana has asked for more than just fund the NDIS, and there's a lot that we can do. For example, lifting the staffing cap, it's currently 3,300 to 10,000 is what the Greens are calling for. And there's so much more, you know, the IT systems that people use and those ridiculous forms, make sure they're fit for purpose, make sure they work for the people that they're designed to be supporting, not having people. There's a mentality on the NDIS that people have to work to get their support, and that is wrong. And that is wrong. We should be right there, right beside disabled people, supporting them as valued members of our society.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. Suzie, your response.
I so agree with you that it can happen to anyone. My nephew had an acquired brain injury and ended up with also an amputee. He's an amputee, and all of a sudden needed services went NDIS. In his situation, he was able to use his mother, who works in special ed, and myself to help fill in those forms. This is one thing that needs to be overhauled, and without that he would not have got his funding, and that shouldn't be the case. That should be far more equitable. The forms and the administration are just far too complex. The other thing is that in regional areas you have people like OTs, social workers, myself, who are filling in those forms, and they're too complex, and we don't have the staff out in regional areas to often provide the services that are needed to support these people out in the regions. It's something that does need to be addressed, and we just need to be able to recruit staff as well. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a complicated issue that does need addressing. The other thing that happened was that during those processes, our community was fearful. So it is this constant fear of what they're going to do and take away services, and that it can be quite traumatising. And yeah, just to be aware of all those issues.
Absolutely. Thank you, Suzie. And Jane, final comments.
Yeah, very quickly. I think it's to do with the mindset of the government of the time. And our government regards anyone who needs any help as with suspicion. So anyone who needs a helping hand is ipso facto likely to be trying to rip the system off. And so we have to treat them like criminals right from the beginning. So anyone who is interacting with our welfare system is going to find themselves treated with suspicion. And the whole aim is to give as little as possible. To get so the entire attitude is completely wrong. Actually, the point should be to help as many people as possible, to assume that people are doing the right thing, or at least trying to do the right thing, help them to do the right thing. And frankly, if a few unscrupulous types get a little bit extra whilst we are kinder and more generous to the rest, that seems to me a small price to pay. What we do is we punish the majority, make them miserable, make them feel awful, desperate sometimes, in case there's a couple of people who might be trying to do the wrong thing. This is just, it's stupid. It costs us more money in the end to try and chase down the handful of people who try to get away with something. And it absolutely destroys the whole point of a system which is meant to be helping people who are already vulnerable and who are already feeling that they can't cope with society as it is. So it's all sorts of technical things that we have to do, sure, but the most important thing is actually change our attitude about what the point of the NDIS is and what's most important, to help people or to make sure nobody gets away with anything they shouldn't have.
Absolutely.
Look who gets away with stuff they shouldn't have. I believe Harvey Norman, private schools, top end of town, they can get away with things.
Not rich people, though. No. Oh, panelists, I had one more question, but I'm going to have to strike it tonight because of time parameters. But it's just been such a pleasure to meet and to talk to all of you tonight about some really important issues that I really don't think are getting enough airtime at the moment. We need to be screaming this stuff from the rooftops, and I'm going to continue to do that, and I hope that you will too. I have a feeling that you will. So that's all we have time for tonight. I'd like to thank our panelists, Rachael Jacobs, Jane Caro, Suzie Holt. Wonderful to have you. Come back to our podcast anytime. And as always, I'd like to thank the wonderful Women for Australia Mods team, particularly Steph, for her help with running tech tonight. I know we had a few technical issues, but thank you very much Steph, and to my team. We are a team of volunteers. This may be our last panel before the election. Who knows? Might do one more. We will be venturing into the world of podcasting, as I said, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, this election, I think it's really good advice to think of the most vulnerable person you know and vote in their best interest. Yeah. And if you can't do that, at least put the Liberals last, because that'll take care of Palmer, right? So thank you so much again. If you'd like to make a donation to Women for Australia, please visit www.womenforaustralia.com.au so we can continue to fund ourselves. We don't pay ourselves money, but we do cover our costs. So anything you can give us would be we'd be very grateful. So good night, everyone, and thank you again. Bye.